Hello, AP World History. I am starting Chapter 20, Part 3. So we just talked about the Berlin Conference. We talked about the carving up of Africa, and I'm going to cover in this section African resistance. So first of all, one thing that you should remember, this is one of those like star circle things, is the Battle of Ottawa. The Battle of Ottawa was the only successful attempt to avoid colonization in Africa, and this occurred in Ethiopia. So what happened here was that Menelik II was the emperor in Ethiopia. The Italians were interested in Ethiopia, and they went into Ethiopia and they signed a treaty with Menelik II. However, as the terms of the treaty unfolded, Menelik built up an arsenal of modern weapons, which was not something that most of Africa had. And then a dispute began over the treaty terms, which led to conflict in 1894. Basically, as I read about this, it looks like the conflict had to do with interpretation between the two different languages that the contract was written in, or the treaty was written in. The Italians and the Ethiopians actually went into battle, and the Ethiopians, because they did have modern weapons, were able to actually defeat the Italians and maintain independence. This is the only successful attempt to avoid colonization. Remember, there's one other country in Africa that does remain uncolonized, and that is Liberia at this period in time. Another example of African resistance, however, was not as successful. So the British had lost Egypt to a local Sudanese. So they were in Egypt, they built the Suez Canal, then there was a battle, and a Muslim leader who followed Sharia law and his contingency took control of Egypt. They decided they really wanted to reconquer Egypt as a colony in 1896, primarily because they wanted to make sure that they protected their rights in the Suez Canal. And the Suez Canal, we'll be talking about that more. It's just really of strategic importance for many lands. So they decide that they are going to have a battle, and they send 6 ships up the river on the Nile. And if you look here, you can see that the British have modern military. They are in formation here to attack. Additionally, they have gunboats along the river. Over here, it's hard to see, but if you look closely, you can see that there are images of people who actually have pretty primitive weapons. So the British have 6 gunboats, 20 machine guns, and numerous rifles. The British forces lost a few hundred men. The Sudanese lost thousands of men in this battle. And so the Sudan then went back into the hands of the British as a colony. Britain is in control. Okay, the Boer War in South Africa was born out of colonization. So we originally had in the south part of Africa, the very tip of Africa, the Dutch trading company called the VOC, and the people who were called Boers or Dutch farmers. They settled Cape Colony in the mid 1600s. Now that settlement in and of itself is not really part of this unit, but I will say that there were some farmers that were displaced, some African farmers that were displaced. It is a good land for breeding cattle and for raising cattle, but also some African farmers remained and lived in harmony with the Dutch farmers. So there wasn't complete animosity there. But the British take it over in 1806, and they come into the Southern Cape, and they basically force a migration, or something, that the Boers, or the Afrikaners as they're known, migrate eastward in what's called the Great Trek. So as they migrate, they do take over more and more land from African tribes like the Xhosa and the Khoisan, who were in that area. They spoke a language called Afrikaans, and so there are still parts of South Africa that speak that language. The British originally tolerated the Boers until the gold and diamonds were discovered. And then really what they wanted was to completely take over South Africa. So you have a white conflict. You have Dutch fighting British, and both Dutch and the British had black soldiers, Africans, as well as laborers that were fighting alongside of them and for their side. So it was a sort of an interesting and different conflict in that regard. The Boers conceded in 1902, and in 1910, the Boers, who had taken this great trek up to the southeast side of South Africa, to integrate into the Union of South Africa. Now, South Africa, since that time, has had a lot of issues. They went through a time period of legalized apartheid and separation, and there is still lingering effects of apartheid that are evident in South Africa. All right, systems of colonial rule. I think this is another great cartoon. Russian grab bag, British grab bag, German grab bag. What do we want to take? Who just kind of like you think everything is up for grabs. So one type of rule would be concessionary companies. I think I talked about this in India. This is how India started out, basically having a lot of British influence, is that the private companies like the East India Company would have land rights, tax rights, and even control of the labor. And they sort of got permission from the colonizing nation, like from Great Britain, or also their power economically or politically within the colony itself. Some areas had direct rule. So this is what happens in India. India starts out as concessionary rule, and then they come under direct rule. So the dominant country's people actually rule from the colony. So we're going to see in India that there are several British troops and politicians stationed in India. And this happened in many areas of Africa as well. Although some areas of Africa used indirect rule. So they use indigenous institutions, and this was true in Rwanda and Burundi. There were the Hutus and the Tutsis. They used these indigenous institutions. Later on, this would end up with a massacre in huge numbers of almost 1 million people in Rwanda and Burundi. But at this time, they say, okay, we'll use the institutions that are in place, but we'll impose these arbitrary boundaries that really have no basis in history or culture or anything like that. And so, like in Nigeria, modern day Nigeria, there are several tribal groups that are represented in that modern day country. Now looking at imperialism in Oceania around 1914. So we have this area here called Micronesia. Here's Hawaii way over here. It's established as a U.S. protectorate. So the English used Australia as a penal colony from 1788 onwards. What does that mean? That means that most of the people that went there were actually prisoners. And no, they weren't violent prisoners. They were debtors. They were poor people, basically. And they were dropped off on, in Australia, and basically had to build their own society. And that's what they did there. Voluntary migrants would soon follow, and then once was gold discovered, it was discovered in 1851, others voluntarily then immigrated to Australia from Great Britain. The smallpox, the measles, they devastate the natives just like they did in the Americas. The Aboriginal people had no natural defenses to these diseases, and many, many thousands upon thousands of natives died of these deadly diseases. This is a picture of a native Aboriginal from Australia holding one of the things that we often associate with Australia, a boomerang. The territory was called by the British terra nullius, land of no one. Again, just sort of emphasizing the fact that many times the original inhabitants of a land were considered uninhabited if they weren't inhabited by Europeans, which to us now seems something that we can't really comprehend. It seems ridiculous, but at the time, that is really what people believed. U.S. imperialism, it sort of takes a different course. So President James Monroe, he tells the Europeans, do not engage in imperialism in the Western Hemisphere. We will not have it. You cannot try to carve up Central America or anything in the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine basically stated all of the Americas are a U.S. protectorate. In other words, we would protect anywhere in North and South America and Central America. So don't mess with the United States. In 1867, the U.S. purchased Alaska from Russia. It was once called Seward's Folly. I don't remember what Seward paid for it. He was a Secretary of State at that time, and people just laughed, like, why would you purchase this land? Like, what's Alaska? As it turns out, Alaska has a lot of natural resources, and it was not folly at all. In 1875, a protectorate was established over Hawaii. This is, the locals overthrow the Queen in 1893. They persuade the U.S. to acquire the islands in 1898. Now, this is sort of a Western version of the story. I have some relatives who are actually Native Hawaiians, or they married Native Hawaiians, and they're in Hawaiian immersion school. And this is the last queen of Hawaii. And they would say that it really wasn't so much the locals overthrowing the queen as more the U.S. presence that just sort of started to dominate Hawaii, and that's why they acquired the islands, and they would end up becoming a state. The U.S. acquires Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines after the Spanish-American War, and then the U.S. builds the Panama Canal in the early 1900s, which was really a huge development for transportation purposes. I want to try to finish this up in this last PowerPoint here, but we'll see. Early Japanese expansion includes moving into Korea, for sure. So in 1876, the Japanese purchase warships from Britain, and they dominate Korea. The Sino-Japanese War is the Chinese-Japanese War, where they acquire some land, Manchukuo being one of the areas that they conquer, and Manchukuo will end up sort of being the puppet empire of Puyi, the last emperor of China. The Russo-Japanese War ends in a Japanese victory, and it shows how weak the Russians were. And now, by the early 20th century, Japan is becoming a major economic, military, and political power. And as we know, they will be major players in World War II. This is the last slide. Significant effects of imperialism. I'm going to just put this out there and let you look at it on your own time and pause and write these down. But remember, labor migrations, economic effects, colonial effect, and then that scientific racism, which is really dominant during the imperial era. And then finally, we have the development of nationalism and anti-colonial movements. Rama Mohan Roy is the father of modern India. He calls for self-government, adoption of selected British practices. For example, outline the practice of sati, which was where the wife would put herself on the funeral pyre of her husband. A little bit more Enlightenment thought involved in the anti-colonial movements. And then the Indian National Congress was formed in 1885, joins with the All India Muslim League in 1916. We will be talking a lot more about India later on, but I did just want to finish this up in this third installment today. All right, thanks. Have a great day. Bye.